He was born in a tiny shared apartment, but his eyes were set on the world stage. How did he get there? Hello everyone, and welcome back to LMJ English, the channel where we learn English through powerful stories from around the world. Today's story is one you won't forget. It's about the rise of a man who went from a small apartment in Leningrad to the presidency of one of the most powerful nations on earth. If you're passionate about stories that teach, inspire, and help you grow your English, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss. Our next story, Humble Beginnings. Vladimir Putin entered the world on October 7, 1952, in a city known then as Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Russia. It wasn't the Russia of grand palaces or rich history that tourists imagine. It was a Russia stitched back together after war had torn it apart. Just 7 years earlier, Leningrad had survived a nearly 900-day siege during World War II, a time when food was so scarce that people boiled wallpaper for the glue and ate it to stay alive. The city was exhausted. Its people carried invisible wounds. Streets still whispered the silence of loss, and buildings stood not in pride but in survival. Vladimir was born into this atmosphere of recovery and quiet determination. His family lived in a kommunalka, a communal apartment, not just small but shared, the kind of space where walls were thin, kitchens were crowded, and life was anything but private. One long corridor connected several tiny rooms, each occupied by a different family. All the families shared one bathroom, one kitchen, and one dream to get by. Inside their room there was barely enough space for a table, a bed, and a small stove. Yet, for young Vladimir this was normal. He never questioned the lines at the imaitai toilet or the mixed smells in the hallway, cabbage soup, fried potatoes, sometimes soap, sometimes worse. It was life. It was real. And it was where his story began. He was the youngest of 3 children, but his 2 older brothers had died before he was born, one during infancy and the other during the siege. So when Vladimir arrived, he was not just a new life. He was a miracle to his grieving parents. His mother, Maria Ivanovna, had survived famine and fear. She worked hard as a factory worker, earning little but giving everything. His father, Vladimir Spiridonovich, had returned from war wounded, his body bearing scars he rarely spoke of. He worked as a laborer, often in silence, always with pride. Together they had very little. Yet what they gave their son was something far more valuable than money. They gave him structure, discipline, and a sense of purpose. His mother woke up early every morning, quietly tiptoeing past the other families to claim her turn at the stove. She made simple breakfasts, black bread, weak tea, maybe a bit of butter if they were lucky. Vladimir learned to eat quickly and quietly. There was no luxury, no toys, no bright-colored books, but there was order, effort, and hope. In the cold winters, he would press his face to the frosty window and watch snow fall on crumbling rooftops. Outside, the world looked harsh, but something inside him was beginning to grow. A quiet fire. A thought, I will not stay small forever. He didn't speak it. He didn't even know how to name it. But it was there, in every bowl of soup, every shared bathroom, every quiet night with nothing but dreams. This was the soil from which the future president of Russia would grow. Not a palace, not a classroom filled with books, but a single room in a crowded apartment where determination was more valuable than comfort, and survival was the first great lesson of life. Personal growth and discipline. In the grey stone streets of Leningrad, where the buildings stood like silent giants and the wind whispered the memories of war, a young boy walked with small, hurried steps. His name was Vladimir. He was not tall, not broad, and certainly not the kind of boy others feared. He was thin, quiet, and often invisible in a crowd. In a world that respected strength and toughness, that made him an easy target. Bigger boys noticed his size. They noticed his silence. And in the playgrounds, on the stairs, and outside the communal apartment building, they teased him. Sometimes they pushed. Sometimes they mocked. It wasn't the kind of bullying that left bruises on the skin, but it left marks somewhere deeper. And Vladimir felt it. But instead of crying or hiding, he watched. He observed how power worked. And one day he made a silent promise to himself, "I will never be weak again." He was just 12 years old when he first stepped into the dim, echoing room of a local sports club. The air smelled of sweat, leather, and old mats. Boys in white uniforms lined up in front of the coach, their belts tied tightly around their waists. Vladimir was drawn to it not for the fights, but for the control, for the focus, for the quiet confidence that came with knowing your strength. He chose judo, a Japanese martial art that was both graceful and brutal, calm and fierce. It wasn't just about strength, it was about strategy, patience, and balance. The perfect path for a boy who wanted to grow, not just muscles, but discipline. His first days were hard. He fell, he failed. He tasted the mat more often than victory, but he kept coming back, day after day, night after night. He trained while others played. He practiced while others rested. He tightened his belt with purpose, not pride. He didn't need to talk, he let his progress speak for him. At home, he didn't brag. His parents didn't shower him with praise or trophies. They taught him that true strength was quiet, and effort mattered more than applause. His room was still small. His meals were still simple. But inside, something was changing. Judo was doing more than teach him how to throw or block. It was teaching him how to think, how to breathe, how to face fear, and keep his heart steady. Years passed, and the boy who once flinched now stood still under pressure. He earned his black belt, not just a symbol of skill, but a crown of self-control. He had turned weakness into wisdom, fear into focus. Even decades later, when cameras followed his every move and presidents called his name, Vladimir Putin would return to the mat. He would still practice, still bow, because judo was more than a sport. It was the beginning of something greater. It was where he learned that real power comes not from domination, but from discipline. That sometimes to win you must first fall, then rise stronger than before. Early ambitions. In every child's life, there comes a moment when a dream quietly plants its roots. For some, it begins with a toy. For others, a story. For Vladimir Putin, it came not from a fairy tale, but from the silent, mysterious presence of men in long coats, who never spoke too loudly and never stayed in one place for too long. It was in the stillness of Soviet evenings, while radio voices hummed in, the background and the city lights flickered through the window, that young Vladimir first heard about the KGB. The stories weren't detailed. Often they were just whispers, rumors of agents who worked in silence to protect the country. But to a boy who had grown up in survival and struggle, the idea of watching without being seen, knowing without being known, fascinated him deeply. These men didn't need applause or attention. Their power was quiet and their loyalty was absolute. At first it was just curiosity, but as he got older, curiosity turned into obsession. The more he learned about the KGB, the more he realized that this was not just a job. It was a path, almost like joining a secret brotherhood. It demanded not only physical readiness, but sharp intellect, emotional control, and a deep understanding of people and politics. It was a life lived behind the curtain, but a life that shaped nations. Putin made a decision. He would become one of them. But how does a small boy from a communal flat earn a place among the country's elite spies? By preparing, quietly, relentlessly, and with total focus. At school, Vladimir wasn't always at the top of the class, but when his ambition became clear to him, so did his motivation. He started studying harder, sharpening his memory, listening more, speaking less. He understood early that the KGB didn't want loud voices or show-offs. They wanted thinkers, planners, people who could read a room without saying a word. He decided to learn German. Not because anyone told him to, but because he knew that mastering a foreign language would be valuable, especially for missions abroad. After class, he would study vocabulary, copy phrases into notebooks, and test himself silently as he walked through the icy streets of Leningrad. He wasn't just learning a language, he was building a tool. When the time came to apply for university, he already knew where he was going, Leningrad State University, not because it was convenient, but because it was strategic. There he enrolled in the law faculty. The KGB often recruited from law programs, and Putin wanted to be ready when opportunity arrived. University life could have been carefree, but for Vladimir, it was another form of training. He didn't go to every party. He didn't waste time on things that didn't matter. He was building himself, quietly and precisely. He stayed under the radar, but professors noticed him anyway. There was a sharpness in his thinking, a seriousness in his eyes. He asked smart questions, read beyond the curriculum, and carried himself with the calm, careful presence of someone who was always thinking 5 steps ahead. By the time he graduated, in 1975, he was ready. And then, almost as if the universe had been watching his every move, the moment came. He was invited to join the KGB. To most, it would have seemed sudden, but to Putin it was the result of years of planning, years of sacrifice, years of walking through life like it was a chessboard, each step taken with precision. When he put on the uniform for the first time, it wasn't just a badge of honor, it was the final piece of a dream born in silence and built with purpose. The boy who once watched the world from a tiny apartment window had entered the world of shadows. But this wasn't the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. KGB career and global exposure. When Vladimir Putin officially joined the KGB in 1975, it was not with fanfare or celebration. There were no cheering crowds or flashing cameras, only a firm handshake, a crisp uniform, and the silent understanding that he now belonged to something far bigger than himself. He was no longer just a man. He was part of a system, a machine built on secrecy, strategy, and service. In the shadows of the Soviet Union, where loyalty was currency and silence was survival, Putin began his life as an intelligence officer. For several years he worked quietly behind the scenes, learning, observing, preparing. Every move was calculated, every report a reflection of discipline. He wasn't just following orders, he was absorbing the nature of power. He watched how information flowed like an invisible river, shaping decisions at the highest levels. He studied people, not just their words, but their weaknesses, their motivations, their patterns. He learned when to speak and when to disappear. Then, in the 1980s, he received his most significant assignment, a posting to East Germany, specifically Dresden. This was not a vacation or a simple transfer. It was a test. The Cold War was at its peak. The world was split into two great spheres, East and West, each side staring the other down like chess masters locked in a match with nuclear consequences. East Germany sat right on that tense dividing line, making it a hotspot for espionage, diplomacy, and danger. To be assigned there meant the KGB trusted him. It meant he was ready. Putin arrived in Dresden speaking fluent German, dressed modestly, and blending in with the local population. He didn't carry a weapon or a badge of glory. Instead, he carried files, observed quietly, and met people under the cover of friendship, trade, or shared interests. His job was to gather intelligence, to understand how Western influences were leaking across the border, and to monitor any threats to Soviet stability. Living in East Germany taught him more than any classroom ever could. He saw the cracks in the system, the fragile economy, the restless youth, the quiet dissatisfaction bubbling beneath the surface. He also witnessed how culture and communication could be more powerful than weapons. It was a time of great complexity, and Putin adapted. He spent hours refining his German, not just speaking it fluently, but with near-native subtlety. He read newspapers, listened to local radio, and memorized routines. He trained himself to notice everything: license plates, the patterns of a neighbor's comings and goings, the tone of a simple hello. But the job wasn't just about intelligence. It was about patience. It was about becoming invisible. Then, in 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell. Crowds stormed the checkpoints. People hugged and cried and screamed in joy. The world was changing faster than anyone had predicted. East Germany began to unravel, and with it the tight grip of the Soviet system loosened. The Cold War, it seemed, was over, but for KGB officers like Putin, it was a moment of chaos. In those uncertain days, protesters surrounded the KGB office in Dresden. The Soviet Union was falling apart back home, and Moscow wasn't answering the phones. Putin reportedly stepped outside with calm confidence, telling the crowd they were under armed protection, even though they weren't. It was a bluff, but it worked. The crowd backed off. Even in crisis, Putin remained cool, strategic, and composed. By 1990, he returned to Leningrad, and in 1991, after nearly 2 decades in the KGB, he quietly stepped away from the service. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The world he had trained to protect was dissolving before his eyes. But the man who walked away from the KGB wasn't the same boy who once dreamed of being a spy. He had seen the world. He had learned how power works, in the open and in the dark. He had learned that empires rise and fall, but those who stay alert, calm, and adaptable always find their way through the storm. Putin was no longer just an agent. He was now something else, a man who had survived the fall of an empire and who was quietly preparing for what came next. Entry into politics. When Vladimir Putin returned to Leningrad in the early 1990s, he came home to a city and a country completely transformed. The Soviet Union, once a symbol of immense power and pride, had crumbled. The red banners were gone, the streets buzzed with uncertainty, and ordinary citizens were trying to make sense of a new world built from the broken pieces of the old. Putin, now a former KGB officer, was a man in search of a new path. He wasn't interested in fame. He didn't dream of giving speeches or shaking hands for the cameras. What he craved was purpose, and soon he would find it, not in the shadows, but in the messy, unpredictable arena of politics. His first steps were quiet, almost invisible. He returned to the university where he had once studied and took on a modest administrative role. He assisted with foreign relations and helped coordinate partnerships. On paper, it was nothing glamorous. But behind the scenes, he was building connections, watching how the new political landscape was forming, how power was shifting, and who was rising to fill the vacuum left by the fallen Soviet government. It was during this time that he met a man who would change the course of his life, Anatoly Sobchak, the newly elected mayor of St. Petersburg and a well-known reformist figure in post-Soviet Russia. Sobchak was charismatic, intelligent, and in need of someone trustworthy to help manage the complicated transformation of the city. He didn't want a showman. He wanted someone sharp, someone loyal. He found that in Vladimir Putin, Putin became one of Sobchak's closest aides, not with loud ambition but with quiet efficiency. He handled foreign contracts, city development projects, and delicate negotiations with skill and precision. When problems arose, Putin didn't panic. He solved them. When meetings became heated, he stayed calm. He didn't demand attention. But people began to notice him. He was unlike many other politicians of the time. While others made promises they couldn't keep, Putin kept his word. While many bragged about reforms, he simply got things done. His background in intelligence had trained him well. He was a master of preparation, a silent strategist who never underestimated anyone, but perhaps his greatest strength was loyalty. Through all the ups and downs of Sobchak's administration, Putin stood by his side. Even when political tides turned and criticism mounted, he didn't walk away. He didn't shift alliances to save himself. That kind of loyalty was rare and powerful. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid in 1996, many assumed Putin's career would fall with him. But once again, Putin did what he always did. He adapted. He packed his bags and moved to Moscow, the heart of Russian politics, ready to start again from the ground up. In Moscow, he began working in the Presidential Property Management Department. It wasn't a flashy role, but it was important, and Putin handled it with the same efficiency and seriousness that had defined his entire life. He didn't speak much, but his reputation followed him. Soon, the higher-ups in the Russian government began to take notice. In a system filled with chaos, corruption, and uncertainty, Vladimir Putin was a man of control. He didn't gossip, he didn't grandstand. He simply delivered results, and in the halls of Russian power, that was a currency more valuable than gold. Rise to power. By 1999, the Russian Federation was a nation teetering on the edge. The economy was fragile, the streets were filled with anxiety, and the people, after nearly a decade of post-Soviet uncertainty, were desperate for a sense of direction. The old promises of democracy and reform had delivered chaos and corruption instead. Citizens stood in breadlines while oligarchs grew richer. Trust in leadership was crumbling like the statues of the old Soviet heroes. The country needed something, or someone, new. In the shadows of the Kremlin, President Boris Yeltsin, aging and in poor health, felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He had led Russia through one of the most turbulent transitions in modern history, but he also knew his time was nearing its end. He needed a successor, not a loud reformer or a flamboyant idealist, but someone stable, someone cold, clever, and calm under pressure. He needed a protector of the state. That man, he believed, was Vladimir Putin. Putin, then serving quietly and efficiently in the upper levels of government, had already built a reputation in elite circles. He was the man who didn't flinch, the one who didn't leak secrets, didn't seek headlines, and didn't make enemies unnecessarily. He was fluent in law shaped by discipline and trained to survive crises. He was not just a bureaucrat, he was a strategist. In August 1999, Yeltsin named Putin Prime Minister of the Russian Federation. To the general public, the name sparked little recognition. Putin, who is he? Russians asked, confused. He was a mystery to the masses, but not for long. Within months of his appointment, Putin was thrust into the spotlight. A wave of violence erupted in the North Caucasus, and terrorist attacks struck Russian cities. People panicked. Fear returned to the streets. But instead of folding under the pressure, Putin responded with force. Military campaigns, security crackdowns, swift decisions. Television screens broadcasted his cold-eyed determination. "We will chase the terrorists everywhere," he declared. "If they're in the airport, we'll get them in the airport. If they're in the toilet, we'll wipe them out in the toilet." It was brutal. It was bold. But for a country battered by indecision and weakness, it was exactly what many wanted to hear. And then, on December 31st, 1999, as the world prepared to welcome a new millennium, Boris Yeltsin stunned the nation. He announced his resignation, effective immediately. In a solemn and unexpected address, he looked into the camera and said, "I am tired. I have done all I could." And with that, he handed the reins of Russia to his chosen successor, acting President Vladimir Putin. Just like that, a man who had once patrolled the streets of East Germany as a quiet KGB agent was now holding the nuclear codes of one of the world's largest nations. But Putin didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into the presidency with silent confidence, like a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He quickly set to work, not with noise, but with action. He stabilized the ruble. He clamped down on rampant corruption. He imposed order where there had been disorder. He met with business leaders and made it clear the wild years of chaos were over. There will be rules now, and those who break them will face consequences. The people, long starved for structure, responded. They began to believe again, not necessarily in democracy or dreams, but in strength. In March 2000, when the first presidential election of the millennium was held, the outcome was decisive. Vladimir Putin was elected president of the Russian Federation with overwhelming support. The quiet man had become the commander-in-chief, and Russia, once fractured and fading, was beginning to rise again. His rise was no accident. It was the result of decades of preparation, observation, and discipline. In a nation that had known czars, generals, and revolutionaries, it now had a leader molded by patience, shaped by silence, and driven by one purpose: to restore Russia's power on the world stage. The chessboard had changed, and Putin was now the player moving the pieces, presidency and national rebuilding. When Vladimir Putin officially took the oath of office in May 2000, Russia stood at a crossroads. The wounds of the 1990s still bled beneath the surface, years marked by broken promises, financial collapse, and the loss of national dignity. To many Russians, the country had become unrecognizable. Once a feared superpower, Russia had been reduced to a fractured shell of its former self. But now, at the dawn of a new millennium, they were looking to a new leader, a man of few words but bold actions, to put the pieces back together. Putin began his presidency not with loud declarations, but with laser-sharp focus. His first mission: restore order. The economy was in ruins. Inflation had eaten through savings. Workers hadn't been paid in months. Crime lords ruled neighborhoods. Corruption had reached the highest levels of government. Oligarchs The ultra-wealthy business tycoons who had risen from the rubble of the Soviet collapse held more influence than the law itself, and the average Russian, beaten down by a decade of instability, had lost hope. Putin's approach was swift and strategic. First, he targeted corruption, not with speeches but with consequences. Investigations were launched, government offices were restructured, high-profile oligarchs who thought themselves untouchable were suddenly being summoned, questioned and in some cases exiled or imprisoned. One by one the message became clear. The era of chaos was over. Then came the economic reforms. Putin introduced strict tax policies, revamped financial systems, and worked to collect revenues that had long gone missing. He courted foreign investors, reassured nervous businesses, and focused heavily on the oil and gas sectors, Russia's most valuable natural resources. As global energy prices climbed, Russia's economy began to rise with them. Salaries returned, pensions were paid, the ruble strengthened. For the first time in years, Russians felt like the state was functioning again, but a stable economy was only part of the vision. Putin knew that a strong nation must also have a strong military. For years, the Russian armed forces had been neglected. Soldiers lacked training, equipment was outdated, and morale was low. Putin changed that. He invested heavily in modernization, introducing new weapons systems, improving military education, and bringing order back to the chain of command. Russia's presence on the global stage began to grow louder, more defined and more respected. He also focused on something deeper, something less measurable but more powerful: national pride. He spoke often of history, of heroes, of the greatness that once was and could be again. He encouraged schools to teach Russian traditions. He restored military parades in Red Square. He reminded the world, and his people, that Russia had never been a follower. It had always been a force, and under his leadership, it would be again. For many Russians, especially those who had felt humiliated during the 1990s, this message resonated like music. Finally, they had a leader who didn't apologize for the past, but who promised a future, filled with strength, order, and dignity. Of course, not everyone agreed with his methods. Critics at home and abroad raised alarms about media control, suppressed opposition, and centralization of power. But for millions of ordinary Russians, one truth mattered more than politics. Life was getting better. Their salaries arrived on time. Their streets were safer. Their country, once mocked, was now feared and respected. In the eyes of many, Vladimir Putin had done the impossible. He had taken a country in collapse and rebuilt it, brick by brick, into a symbol of resilience, and he was just getting started. Strongman. Image and public persona. As Vladimir Putin settled into his role as president, it became clear that he was not just rebuilding Russia's economy and institutions, he was also rebuilding the image of its leader. In a world where politicians were often seen as soft-spoken diplomats or behind-the-scenes administrators, Putin introduced a completely different model: the strongman. But this image wasn't born out of accident. It was crafted, deliberate, and incredibly effective. Gone were the stiff grey suits and distant leaders of the Soviet era. In their place came a president who dove into icy Siberian lakes, rode horses bare-chested through the wilderness, flew fighter jets, and steered submarines beneath the Arctic ice. The photos were released with perfect timing, each one telling a silent story. This is not just a politician. This is a warrior, a protector, a man who leads from the front. He wanted Russians and the world to see him as someone who could. wrestle with danger, whether in the form of wild bears or international diplomacy. And while critics called these stunts theatrical, many citizens admired them. After years of weak leadership and national shame, they were now led by a man who seemed fearless, almost mythic. This carefully curated persona extended beyond adventure. Putin emphasized discipline both in his own lifestyle and in what he expected of others. He was known to rise early, follow a strict fitness routine, and maintain a sharp focus on health and self-control. He didn't just preach order, he lived it. In public, he rarely showed strong emotion. His speeches were calm, measured, and direct. He didn't shout to be heard. He simply commanded attention. His public image was also deeply intertwined with national pride. He wore military uniforms during key national events, stood at attention during parades, and revived many traditional symbols of Russian greatness. His leadership style drew from both the past and the present, a combination of Soviet steel and modern media savvy. But behind the scenes, Putin understood something even more important than physical strength: control over the message. He didn't leave his image to chance. Under his leadership, most of the major media outlets in Russia gradually came under state influence. Television, still the most powerful medium in the country, presented a version of events that reinforced the leader's strength, the nation's stability, and the dangers of outside interference. Critics were marginalized. Opposition voices were softened or silenced, and all the while the image of Putin, stoic, focused, unshakable, remained center stage. Internationally, this strategy drew criticism. Many accused him of building a cult of personality, of limiting freedom of expression, and of engineering a media environment where truth and power became blurred. But at home, millions continued to support him. Why? Because the streets were safer, salaries were paid, and Russia once again felt like a country that mattered. Putin had crafted something rare in modern politics, a persona that transcended policy. He wasn't just leading the country, he was embodying it. To his supporters, he was the living spirit of Russian strength and resilience. To his critics, he was a master manipulator of image and emotion. But either way, one thing was certain. Vladimir Putin had transformed himself from a silent KGB agent into one of the most recognizable and formidable leaders in the world. And the world was watching. Wealth and privacy. For all the visibility, Vladimir Putin commands on the global stage. His speeches, his strongman stunts, his presence at military parades. There is another side to him that remains shrouded in silence: his personal life. While the world sees a carefully crafted public figure, very few know what happens when the cameras are turned off. It is this contrast between public power and private mystery that adds another layer to Putin's complex character. Over the years, numerous reports and investigations have surfaced, suggesting that Putin is not just powerful, but also immensely wealthy. He is believed to control assets far beyond the modest presidential salary he publicly receives. Whispers of private jets, luxury watches, yachts the size of buildings, and even a vast palace on the Black Sea, dubbed Putin's Palace, have captured headlines and imaginations. Photographs of golden staircases, underground theaters, and private vineyards have made rounds on the internet. And yet Putin never confirms. He rarely even responds. When questioned, he usually smiles faintly and says very little, another signature of his carefully measured approach. In Putin's world, what you don't say is often more powerful than what you do. But wealth is only one half of the enigma. The other is privacy, particularly around his family. For decades, Putin kept his wife and children almost entirely out of the spotlight. His marriage to Lyudmila Shkrebneva, a former flight attendant, lasted for nearly 30 years. Together they had 2 daughters, Maria and Katerina. Yet, even as he rose to power, almost no photographs of the girls were released. Their names were rarely mentioned in public. They did not attend state events, no interviews, no gossip columns. They were ghosts in the world of public life. Why such secrecy? According to Putin, it was about protection. The world he lived in was dangerous, and he wanted his daughters to grow up with normal lives, free from the pressure and security of constant public exposure. He believed children should not be used for political image or spectacle. And so, while most world leaders brought their families into the limelight, Putin did the opposite. He hid his. In 2013, during a quiet intermission at a ballet performance, he and Lyudmila appeared together before a state television camera. There, in a brief and calmly delivered statement, they announced their divorce. There was no drama, no emotional confessions, just a shared acknowledgement that their lives had grown apart. Since then, Putin's personal life has become even more mysterious. Rumors swirl about romantic partners, hidden families, and secret estates, but none are ever confirmed. Every story is met with the same response: silence. This intense privacy has drawn criticism from some and admiration from others. In an age where leaders post selfies and tweet their thoughts by the hour, Putin remains a man of closed doors and locked drawers. He believes that a leader should be known by his actions, not his dinner table. To his supporters, this makes him noble, untouched by the hunger for attention that defines so many modern politicians. To his critics, it adds to the image of a man with too many secrets. But no matter where you stand, one truth remains. Behind the face that appears on television screens, on billboards, and in official photographs, lies a man whose inner world is almost entirely unknown, and that is exactly how he wants it. International strategy and influence. Vladimir Putin didn't just want to fix Russia from the inside. He wanted the world to notice. To him, national strength wasn't complete until it echoed beyond borders into boardrooms, battlefields, and headlines across the globe. And so, as he restored Russia's domestic pride, he turned his sharp gaze outward, crafting a foreign policy that would make Russia a global power once again. But unlike the brute military dominance of the Soviet Union, Putin's strategy was more nuanced. It was a game of chess, not checkers, measured, patient, and ruthlessly calculated. His first priority was to rebuild alliances, especially in places where Western influence was weakening or unwanted. Countries like China, India, and many across the Middle East became key players in Putin's grand vision. Through a mix of trade deals, military cooperation, and shared political interests, he positioned Russia as an alternative to Western dominance, a power that respected sovereignty and tradition, rather than trying to reshape governments in its own image. With China, the partnership grew strong. Putin saw not just a neighbor, but a strategic ally against the Western-led world order. Together, the two countries developed massive energy projects, pipeline agreements, and military exercises that sent a clear message. There was a new axis forming in the East. In the Middle East, where alliances are often fragile and ever-changing, Putin played the long game. While Western powers struggled to balance diplomacy and intervention, Putin offered stability, even if it came with hard choices. He supported leaders like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, ensuring Russia had a decisive role in shaping the outcome of the war and securing a critical military foothold in the region. Russian jets, advisors, and weaponry arrived, And so did Putin's influence, growing stronger with every negotiation and ceasefire. But geography wasn't enough. Putin understood that in the 21st century, wars weren't only fought with tanks and troops, they were fought with information. Under his leadership, Russia invested heavily in cyber power. State-backed hackers became digital warriors, capable of penetrating systems, influencing public opinion, and disrupting adversaries without firing a single shot. Accusations flew across headlines. Election meddling, data leaks, cyber attacks on infrastructure. Russia denied it all, but the impact was undeniable. Putin had found a way to expand Russia's power without traditional warfare. The battlefield had shifted, and he was prepared. Perhaps the most controversial move of all came in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, a peninsula that had been part of Ukraine. To the international community, it was a clear violation of sovereignty. To many Russians, however, it was a historic correction. Putin defended the action with the language of identity, history, and national pride. Crimea has always been part of Russia in the hearts of our people, he said. The world responded with sanctions and condemnation. But at home, Putin's popularity soared. He had done what no leader had dared, redrawn borders in the 21st century. And in doing so, he sent a message. Russia would no longer ask permission to protect its interests. Putin's foreign policy was never about making friends. It was about making Russia respected or feared on the global stage. He built military strength not just to defend, but to deter. He forged partnerships not based on ideology, but on leverage. And he moved quietly, always looking 10 steps ahead. While some saw him as a destabilizing force, others saw a master strategist, one who knew how to find cracks in global unity and turn them into opportunities for power. He didn't just want Russia to be heard again. He wanted it to be impossible to ignore. Leadership style. From the moment Vladimir Putin stepped into the corridors of power, it became clear he would not lead like those before him. He wasn't there to charm the public or impress journalists. He wasn't running to win applause. Instead, his leadership was marked by a single, unwavering principle: stability over popularity. In a country that had endured revolutions, collapses, and reform after reform, Putin offered something Russians had not seen in years: predictability. And for many that was more comforting than any campaign promise. At the core of his style was a calm, calculated mind. Putin rarely raised his voice. He rarely made spontaneous decisions. Every move was deliberate, every word chosen with care. In meetings with world leaders, he often sat still, listening more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with precision, direct, clear, and unshaken. His demeanor projected strength not through volume, but through silence. This quiet strength extended into how he governed. Putin surrounded himself with people he trusted, not because they were loud, but because they were loyal. Loyalty in his eyes was not just a virtue, it was a requirement. He valued those who stood by him through challenges and chaos, who didn't leak secrets to the press or bend under pressure. To Putin, betrayal wasn't just a personal insult, it was a weakness that couldn't be tolerated. He built a government where loyalty was rewarded and defiance was punished. This gave him an edge. While political parties fought among themselves and foreign governments changed direction with each election, Putin's system remained steady. He didn't need to be the most loved. He only needed to be the most prepared. Strategic thinking was another hallmark of his leadership. Putin wasn't interested in short-term popularity spikes. He thought in years, not weeks. Whether it was restoring the military, expanding Russia's influence abroad, or managing internal opposition, his focus was always on long-term outcomes. Even when decisions were unpopular in the moment, he was willing to endure criticism if he believed they would strengthen Russia's position in the future. One of his favorite sayings reflects this mindset. Leadership is not about staying in power, it's about staying relevant. To stay relevant, Putin adapted. He studied global trends, listened to analysts, and adjusted tactics as needed. He used history as a guide, but not as a cage. He wasn't afraid to change laws, shift alliances, or rethink strategies, as long as it helped Russia maintain control over its own destiny. And that perhaps is the most defining trait of his leadership: control. Putin believes chaos is the enemy of progress. And so, whether it's managing the media, the economy, or foreign policy, he seeks to limit uncertainty. Not because he fears change, but because he believes too much freedom leads to fragmentation. In his Russia, the center must always hold. This style has earned him admiration from some and deep criticism from others. His opponents accuse him of authoritarianism, of silencing dissent, of centralizing too much power. But to his supporters, he is the one man who stood against the collapse, who brought back the pride, and who held the country together when everything seemed to fall apart. Putin doesn't claim to be perfect. He doesn't pretend to be a man of the people, but he has never wavered in his mission to keep Russia strong, stable, and sovereign, and whether loved or feared, that mission has defined every decision he's ever made. Legacy and vision. As Vladimir Putin's time in power stretches across decades, one truth becomes increasingly clear. He is not just governing a nation, he is shaping a legacy carved from ambition, guarded by strategy, and guided by a vision far larger than just one presidency. Putin never saw Russia's future as one of quiet cooperation within a Western-led world order. He imagined something bolder, something more independent, more influential, more sovereign. In his eyes, the 21st century would not belong to a single superpower, but to a multipolar world where several great nations shared leadership and responsibility, and, in that vision, Russia would not take the back seat. Putin believes that global power should be balanced, that no single nation, alliance, or ideology should dominate the international stage. He challenges the idea that only Western values can define democracy, human rights, or progress. Instead, he promotes a world where every country can preserve its identity, protect its traditions, and pursue its path, free from foreign interference. At T. The heart of this belief is a desire to redefine Russia's place in history. To many Russians, the fall of the Soviet Union was not just the collapse of a political system, it was a loss of dignity, a loss of identity. Putin has worked tirelessly to restore that. Through powerful speeches, large-scale projects, and cultural revival, he's reminded citizens that Russia is not a nation to be pitied or overlooked. It is a civilization with a rich past and a rightful place at the center of global affairs. But Putin's vision isn't built on military strength and foreign policy alone. Domestically, he's invested heavily in education, healthcare, and technological innovation, the pillars of any lasting legacy. He launched reforms to modernize schools and expand access to rural areas. He championed programs to inspire young Russians to pursue science, engineering, and artificial intelligence. He visited classrooms, spoke to students, and encouraged the next generation to see themselves not just as workers, but as builders of the future. In healthcare, Especially across Russia's vast and underserved regions, his government built new clinics and upgraded hospitals. He prioritized maternal health, emergency care, and access to basic services. For a country with such geographic and economic diversity, this effort was no small task. But it was one that earned the trust of many rural voters, and throughout his policies, one theme persisted: a return to traditional Russian values. Putin has long believed that national identity is rooted in culture. He has defended the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, spoken out for the importance of family and social order, and pushed back against what he sees as the erosion of morality in the modern world. Critics call these views conservative or even regressive, but to many of his supporters they represent a moral compass in an age of uncertainty. He speaks not only of economic growth, but of cultural survival. Not just modernization, but preservation. Of course, his legacy is not without controversy. Around the world, people debate whether he has brought progress or suppression, stability or stagnation. But even his harshest critics must admit he has changed the shape of modern Russia, and that in the end is what Putin seems to care about most. Not applause, but impact. Not popularity, but permanence. He is not building for today's headlines, he is building for the history books. And in those pages he hopes to be remembered not just as a president, but as a definer of an era. Resilience and lessons. Vladimir Putin's journey from a shared apartment in post-war Leningrad to the highest seat of power in one of the world's largest countries is more than a political biography. It is a story of resilience, discipline, and the enduring power of vision. Whether admired or criticized, his life offers powerful lessons, not just for future leaders, but for anyone striving to overcome adversity and leave a mark on the world. The core of Putin's story is the lesson of resilience. Born into poverty, surrounded by the physical and emotional ruins of war, young Vladimir was not given a path, he carved one. He lost siblings before he ever met them. He lived in cold, crowded spaces. He stood in line for basic needs. But even in those early years, he began to learn that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about refusing to break. He was pushed. He was tested. He was underestimated. But every time he responded not with anger or excuses, but with preparation, with patience, with a plan. This mindset would serve him well not only in childhood, but through every chapter of his leadership. Another key lesson is strategic thinking. Putin did not chase power blindly. Every step he took, whether learning judo, mastering German, choosing law school, or entering politics, was intentional. He understood the long game. That success is not about shortcuts or sudden fame, but about building quietly, learning constantly, and striking when the moment is right. He often speaks of chess, of watching the board, studying the opponent, and never making a move you can't defend. In a world full of noise and distractions, Putin reminds us of the power of clarity, timing, and staying several steps ahead. But strategy means nothing without principles. Though some view him as overly controlling, others admire how he has always stayed true to his beliefs about sovereignty, loyalty, and strength. He doesn't chase trends or try to please everyone. He governs with a clear sense of what he believes is best for Russia, even when it earns him criticism abroad. For better or worse, Putin's leadership is not shaped by popularity polls. It is shaped by conviction, and that is a rare quality in modern leadership. Perhaps most inspiring is the lesson of growth, not just national but personal. Putin's story is filled with moments where he could have given up or disappeared into obscurity. When the Soviet Union collapsed, he might have stayed quiet. When his mentor lost political office, he could have faded away. But instead, each ending became a new beginning. He didn't resist change. He adapted. He reinvented himself, not by changing who he was, but by using every experience as a stepping stone. This is a powerful reminder. Greatness isn't reserved for those born into privilege or power. It belongs to those who keep moving, keep learning, and keep fighting for what they believe in, even when the world tells them they can't. Whether or not you agree with his politics, Putin's life holds a mirror to the values that build strong individuals: resilience, strategy, self-discipline, and vision. In the end, history will decide how Vladimir Putin is remembered. But one thing is certain: his story will be told for generations, not just for the power he held, but for the lessons his life continues to teach. If you found this story interesting or learned something new, please like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Your support helps us create more meaningful and educational content. Don't forget to subscribe so we can bring you even more powerful and inspiring stories. 20 key vocabulary, repeated throughout. Resilience, the ability to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness, often used to describe Putin's journey through hardships. Discipline, a controlled and organized way of behaving, especially through self-control and consistent effort. A core value in Putin's personal development and leadership. Strategy, a careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal, usually over a long period. Putin's decisions are described as strategic rather than impulsive. Loyalty, the quality of being faithful to someone or something, a trait Putin demands in his circle and values highly in his own actions. Stability, a state of being steady, secure, and not easily changed. This is often used to describe what Putin promised and delivered to Russia. Sovereignty, the authority of a state to govern itself without external interference. A recurring theme in Putin's foreign policy. Identity, the qualities, beliefs, and values that make a nation or individual unique. Putin works to restore and protect Russia's national identity. Power, the ability to influence or control people and events, central to Putin's rise and leadership style. Control, the act of managing or directing something with authority, seen in how Putin governs, presents himself, and controls media narratives. Legacy, what a person leaves behind after they are gone, especially in terms of reputation or achievements. Putin's long-term vision is strongly tied to his legacy, reputation, the general opinion about someone or something. Putin carefully maintains a reputation of strength and resolve, authority, the official power to make decisions or enforce rules. Putin's leadership emphasizes strong centralized authority. Opposition, resistance or criticism, especially from political rivals or foreign governments. A frequent challenge in his career. Adaptability, the ability to adjust to new conditions or situations, highlighted in Putin's transition from KGB officer to politician. Leadership, the act of guiding or directing a group or country. The entire narrative revolves around how Putin exercises and defines leadership. Influence, the power to affect others' actions, decisions, or thinking. Putin uses both visible and invisible methods to exert influence globally. National pride, a feeling of love and respect for one's country. Putin's policies and image often aim to restore or reinforce this pride in Russians. Public image, the perception people have of someone in public life. carefully crafted and maintained throughout Putin's career. Multipolar world, a global structure where power is distributed among multiple countries, not dominated by one. Central to Putin's international vision. Strength, both physical and symbolic power, repeatedly used to define Putin's character, choices, and leadership style.